Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, the curator of MERL collections.
And we're both recording the intro this time.
We are. I'm back.
I actually thought what could have been funny is if you did it as both of us.
I'm not sure I could do your accent.
I couldn't do yours either. I didn't attempt to try.
Yeah. I'd have to have the subtlest hint of Welsh, from what I recall, because you've got that subtle hint of Welsh going on.
Well, I've got my dad's from East London and my mum's Welsh, and I grew up in Grantham.
There you go.
So that's a real hot pot, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't do that.
No.
Yeah. Let's not do that.
No, let's not do that. This episode even, we're back with Professor Paddy Bullard from the University of Reading and Isabel Hughes, MERL's Associate Director.
And we're talking about Jane Austen. And last time you'll remember that we talked about loads of things that connect Jane Austen to the museum's collections. We talked about agricultural improvement and other forms of improvement. We talked about breeding, that's breeding of livestock, but also good breeding in people. And we talked about hedges, lots of points of connection.
And wrong'uns.
And wrong'uns, yeah, lots of talk about wrong'uns. And this time we'll be talking in much more detail about improvement and two sorts of improvement, really, both of which connect to England's landscapes. The first of which is all about improving farming. So it's the British agricultural revolution. It's a sort of moment of staggering change in terms of the implementation of science and model farming. And the second is another kind of improvement. Joe, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and the second kind is much more the improvement of landscapes in the manner of kind of stately homes, the types of beautiful architecture that you see in Jane Austen novels and the adaptations. Yeah,
so I think it's one of those things that people recognise as characteristic of England's landscapes, the notion of the green and pleasant land. The notion of the green and pleasant land encapsulates this notion of kind of pristine green spaces, open parkland, trees looking serene and elegant in those spaces, often deer roaming across parks, big country houses. A lot of it is quite iconic of what England represents. But of course that, alongside the kind of agricultural changes that we'll be talking about, some of the early beginnings of, all leads us to a point where we're perhaps pushing back against nature, we're controlling nature, we're unwilding places and spaces. So it feels not very of the moment, but certainly very of Jane Austen's time.
It feels very much kind of like nature in scare quotes. That's a lot of what we talk about in these episodes, I think, is the sort of England's natural landscapes not actually being that natural and how they come to exist.
Yeah, and we've got some great examples on our doorstep, and an amazing example of that is Fobney Marsh. We had a brilliant conversation, Joe and I, the other day with Adrian Lawson, who is one of the Fobney Martians, so titled.
Would you introduce the Fobney Martians and what they do, Ollie?
So Fobney Marsh is a piece of land within Reading, which is essentially it's a mini accidental nature reserve. So it's been managed as a piece of tenanted farmland for many years. It did have big livestock on it, so it had cattle on it. Those cattle were sort of wandering around and stomping the marsh, and the effect of large animals, large herbivores stomping in marshland like that is that it creates a really nice environment for waterfowl, for birds. So it was a really amazing natural space within the wider urban centre of Reading. And the people tenanting that farmland decided to take the cattle off the land. And as a consequence, it became less effective for those birds. So what Adrian and his fellow Martians do is they go and stomp the land. They also manage it in other ways. They're essentially nature guardians for that space. So hopefully coming up next year, we'll be able to talk to Adrian. But for those of you listening to this episode as it comes out this week, you will also be able to go on Sunday, go online, book tickets. You can go to the latest Martian Stomp, and they go out in numbers and stomp the marsh to make it a healthier natural environment.
And that's a stone's throw from central Reading as well. So yeah, if you're local and interested in looking for something to do this weekend that's a bit different, go and join the Martians.
Yeah. So the Fobney Martians website is ruralreading.com.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes.
So a far cry in many ways from Jane Austen, but connects us back to that point of managing land, thinking about how to manage land, how to change and improve land in different ways. This is a kind of different form of improvement to the two forms of improvement we talk about in this episode.
And to introduce a third form of improvement before we begin the episode, if you're enjoying the pod, please leave us reviews and ratings on streaming sites because it really helps us reach new people. Enjoy the episode.
Enjoy. So last time we were mainly focusing on agriculture and farming, on some of those formative influences coming through from Jane Austen's father and his farming interests. This time we want to segue a little bit to thinking about how ideas of the rural and the urban play out in her work and her writing, but also how they were heavy influences in shaping her through her own life. I wonder whether we could kick off by you giving us a bit of a chronology, because obviously we've started in these rural contexts, and as I understand it, she moves into more urban contexts in her own life. So where does she move, and when does she move, and what sort of periods are we talking about?
So she's born in 1775 in a country area, so she lives in Steventon. Her father's the local vicar, so she lives in the vicarage. In 1801, her father sells up the farm, not the land, but the equipment, and gives his living and the vicarage to one of his sons. He moves everybody to Bath, Jane and her older sister Cassandra and her mother, who's also called Cassandra. They live in Bath for a few years, and then the Reverend sadly dies, I think quite suddenly. They have been living in reasonable rented property, but gradually they stay in worse and worse surroundings, so cheaper and cheaper lets. They're not terribly happy there. They don't really have very much money because they don't inherit it. They end up staying in different places, renting, or else staying with family for a little bit. That goes on until 1809, when Jane's brother Edward, he wasn't the eldest, but he was a favourite son who was adopted by some distant relatives who didn't have any children of their own. He has an estate in Chawton, which is quite near Steventon, where she grew up, and he offers them to live in a cottage on the estate. She moves back to the countryside and she lives there pretty much until she becomes ill, and she dies in Winchester, but she's there for like 2 or 3 weeks. So really, the productive bit of her life, I think, is in these two rural villages.
Like all good things, beginning and ending with the rural. That's what we like at the Museum of English
That's
Rural
our
Life.
podcast format,
Yeah.
I hope, yeah.
Yeah. So this is really interesting to me. I think I've mentioned this in earlier podcasts. This idea of the countryside, as described, only comes into being bang in the middle of the 19th century. It's at that moment when there's a kind of tipping point and there are suddenly more people in urban contexts, in towns and cities, than there are in rural contexts. It's really hard for us to get our heads around this from a sort of modern worldview, where we're in the middle of Reading recording this podcast. In 1801, Reading only had about 9,500 people living in it. It's a lot larger now. So for those of you unfamiliar with Reading, it's more or less a city, even though it hasn't got city status. It's a very big town.
England's largest town.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So trying to imagine ourselves into Austen's world, where people are predominantly rural, is quite difficult to do. And these tensions about the rural and the urban, I think, are really interesting. So from my understanding of the way she's writing about people's lives, the urban feels like it's held up both as a kind of sophisticated space of high society, but it's also slightly problematic. You know, lots of the people who embed themselves more in the urban and have aspirations more towards the urban and to the city life seem to be the more problematic characters. Is that an overly simplistic reading of things?
There are all sorts of interesting sources that we could think about for answering that question. Austen definitely has a sense of the difference of life in the urban and the rural, and she has a sense of it being something which is determined to a certain extent by character. There's a very interesting letter where she's talking about one of her brother Henry's servants who's obviously come from Hampshire and gone to live with Henry. I imagine it's in London, but has given up what I assume was rather a nice, lucrative urban post as an urban servant in order to go back to the country. And Austen, of course, sees it in literary terms. She says he is more like Cooper nursing his hares. So that's William Cooper, the poet of Olney, than he is like Samuel Johnson observing the high tide of humanity at Charing Cross. It's quite interesting seeing her talking about someone who is from the servant classes, thinking about the countryside like that. So she certainly acknowledges that. As far as the fiction is concerned, the really interesting novel in this respect is Emma. Emma is set in a small town called Highfield, which is basically Leatherhead in Surrey. We know that it's within walking distance, or within riding distance rather, of London, because one of the characters goes into London to get his hair cut. George Knightley is very, very offended by this.
We all do that, surely.
Yeah, we all do that from time to time, exactly. The fascinating thing about this particular setting is that you get this real sense that this is a town which is looking towards the city. People are coming backwards and forwards from the city quite often. We heard in the last episode about John Knightley, who is George Knightley's brother. He's a lawyer. He isn't going to inherit Donwell Abbey, so he has to go to London to earn a living, and he's a very wealthy and successful lawyer living in Bloomsbury in central London. Frank Churchill pops into London in order to get his hair cut, but is in actual fact buying a Broadwood piano, which then is mysteriously delivered to his secret love, Jane Fairfax, later on, much to everyone's confusion. So there's all this sort of urban orientation in Emma. But at the same time, you have this sense of deep England, of Angleterre profonde, opening up at our backs behind in Emma as well. Donwell Abbey feels like a very, very rural place indeed. There's a very interesting chapter in The Country and the City by Raymond Williams called Three Around Farnham, where he looks at the way that three rural writers of the same period, that's William Cobbett, Jane Austen, and Gilbert White, author of The Natural History of Selborne, are essentially talking about the same Hampshire landscape at roughly the same time. In actual fact, they're talking about it decades apart, but there's some foreshortening of history that we're allowed, that Raymond Williams can get away with because he's Raymond Williams. And it's interesting to think of Austen as a Hampshire writer, and the nearest she comes to that is when she's talking about Leatherhead and the Surrey Hills. You can just have the sense of all that deep rurality, which she herself belongs to, over Emma's shoulder and somewhere in the background.
One of the highlights of the Austen display we have at the moment is a letter by Austen, an original letter by Austen to her sister Cassandra.
Here's just a little extract from the letter. She's describing a walk that she goes on to her sister Cassandra, who's staying in a place called Kintbury nearby, Reading. Going to put on my Jane Austen voice now.
Please do.
I think it's very fast. I imagine her speaking extremely quickly. Austen writes, "My adventures since I wrote to you 3 days ago have been such as the time would easily contain. I walked yesterday morning with Mrs. Chamberlain to Lincombe and Widcombe, and in the evening I drank tea with the Holders. Mrs. Chamberlain's pace was not quite so magnificent on this second trial as in the first. It was nothing more than I could keep up with, without effort. And for many, many yards together on a raised furrow footpath, I led the way. The walk was very beautiful, as my companion agreed whenever I made the observation. And so ends our friendship, for the Chamberlains leave Bath in a day or two. Prepare likewise for the loss of Lady Fust, as you will lose before you find her." There's just such an authentic note of Austen there, like all of that humour and sarcasm built into this very, very everyday thing. I love the walk was very beautiful, as my companion agreed whenever I made the observation. They obviously found it quite difficult to keep the conversation up together, I think.
Yeah.
But to my mind, Austen's rural contrasts quite significantly with some aspects of what this museum collection represents. It's a museum that has a rootedness in traditions about understanding vernacular and rural life and working life, partly through mid-20th century ideas about social history, partly through later 19th century ideas about folklore and folk life. But her view of the rural is obviously informed by much earlier traditions. You've got antiquarian traditions emerging at exactly the same time as she's writing. They're slightly different. You've got William Hone, you've got William Pine and his way of depicting visually rustic and sort of working people in their costume. But I guess hers is a different vision. Is it the same tradition as these antiquarian ideas? Is she familiar with those? Or is it an entirely separate way of showing the rural, showing the vernacular, or thinking about that relationship with other aspects of society?
I think she's just very good at observing the life around her, and it's very, very meticulous. I can't think of examples of folk life that she particularly dwells on. I mean, things crop up. We've talked about that in earlier episodes. Artifacts that we have in the museum appear in the novels, but I don't think she has that view of things. She's just a very, very good observer of manners and behaviour and people.
So it's more about the social norms and the stratification of things and the way in which you navigate these different spaces than it is about the people and the things they're doing and some need to chart or tell that story or capture it.
Yes, I think so. I don't think she sets out to describe the countryside exactly. It's just it's there because that's her world and that's what she observes really closely.
I suppose this harks back to Paddy's description last episode of Jane Austen as a sort of digital camera, the level of precision that she exhibits. She's a digital camera of a very specific part of countryside life. Like, she's not seeking to capture that kind of holistic view of it. She's interested in the people and the scenes in her stories and delivers those with really amazing detail. And I guess that's one of the reasons why people love her so much.
So bringing that back to that question of the rural and the urban, even though by the sound of things she's in some ways less productive or less inspired by the time in Bath or in these other urban places that she lives, she's presumably observing in those places and picking up on some of these elements that then make their way into later books. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. But also, I think that a lot of the characters that come from the towns and the cities are difficult. They're problematic for the story, aren't they? They sort of disrupt the life that she knows and observes.
Am I right that Lydia and George Wickham run off to a town?
I think they go to Brighton, don't they?
Yeah.
They initially go to London.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
to get married. And yes.
They meet
Oh, well,
they elope from Brighton. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've read the book, but also seen all the adaptations, and I remember there's a scene of Lydia and Wickham in a very like urban. I'm sure it's like a bar or like something. I don't know. Maybe it's not. Paddy's been very confused.
Like it was like a bar.
A bar in Brewdog.
And Brighton's strongly associated with
Brighton was a flesh pot, wasn't it? It was where
a flesh pot that was associated with the Prince Regent,
right?
Who we know that she really disapproved of, because I think she says that in the letters. And there's this thing
she
about
really
her,
disapproved of him, but she did dedicate Emma to him. So.
She did, but don't we think that she was sort of talked into it by her publisher rather than fulsomely wanting to mention him?
It's a complicated story. She knew that with the dedication, she secured the dedication, and once she'd secured it, she knew that her last publisher, William Murray, was more likely to publish Emma quickly once that dedication was in place. So she used it as leverage with her publisher.
Could we get a quick explainer of the Prince Regent and who he was?
Okay, so he's the son of George III, who was the one who's known as Farmer George sometimes.
Why was he known as Farmer George?
Because he was terribly interested in farming and actually did it.
Right.
So he's an agricultural improver.
Right. Okay. So
this is driven from the top. This sense that we've got to improve agriculture and modernise and
Oh, that's interesting.
So the Prince Regent is his eldest son, and George III was also the one who's the madness of King George. So he did suffer from mental illness, and so the Prince Regent came in power during that period. But he was very much frowned upon because he led a dissolute sort of life, and he was famous for that. But he did also make sure that the Brighton Pavilion was built, so it's not all bad. But he was a bad lot.
Right, I see.
So coming back to that idea of improvement, we talked a little bit in the last episode about agricultural improvement and focused heavily on the farming side of things. There's another side to this improvement that Paddy was explaining to us that's about creating these wonderful vistas from your big country houses and making those estates into big, modern, acceptable society spaces. And to my mind, this feels like it's a reflection of those kind of urban spaces that are seen slightly as more sophisticated. In some cases, it's slightly different. I wonder whether we could talk a little bit about designed landscapes and the narratives of those kinds of improvement, the ones that you mentioned that are about depopulating and creating country parks and deer parks and ha-has and these sort of tricks of the landscape design world. This is a big factor, certainly in Mansfield Park, but I assume it comes up in some of the other books as well.
It comes up in the other novels as well, yes. I mean, it's a particularly important feature for a novel we haven't discussed yet, I think, Sense and Sensibility. The character John Dashwood, who's the sort of baddie of the piece, he displaces Eleanor and Marion Dashwood and their mother from the family home.
A wrong-un.
He's a wrong-un. He's another wrong-un. And he, as soon as he gets control of the family home, starts improving it ruthlessly. And one of the things that we just sort of have a glimpse of is that he's cut down a grove of walnut trees in order to make way for a magnificent greenhouse. And in almost the same sentence, he describes spending an enormous amount of money on draining a moor so that it can be converted into agricultural land. So we have the improvement of waste, which of course these days is regarded as being environmental desecration.
When you say waste, do you mean that in terms of kind of wilderness?
Yes, absolutely. Quite often it's heathland, it's often fen and bog, but it's not easy converting that land to farmland. You have to have drainage systems, you have to have pumps. There's a whole wonderful technology of doing that, which is emerging during this period, of course. But above all, it takes capital investment. It's a really expensive thing to do, and it's a big move for a family to make. But the plus side is that for generations into the future, that land becomes productive land.
For any of you interested in waste in the terms that Paddy's described it, I think a discussion of waste crops up briefly in our episodes with Katrina Navikas. She talks about different types of land that's perhaps marginal or peripheral to mainstream agricultural land that's maybe less desirable, but potentially has, some advantage to it. So it may be worth enclosing if you can find a way to make use of it. So it sort of comes through in these tensions about different types and categorizations of land over a very long period.
I want to say that we talked about it in the episode with Dolly Jorgensen as well, about bringing your pigs to the waste.
It's entirely possible we did. Yeah.
If not the word, then the concept.
Yeah.
Definitely the improvements are a period where that wasteland becomes increasingly inaccessible to ordinary people, and particularly people who are villagers and on the margin. William Cobbett famously says that if you're in a poor landscape, if you're in an unimproved landscape where the landowners aren't draining and hedging and enclosing, you're more likely to be able to scrape a good subsistence living. Whereas if you're in a rich landscape like the Austens, then the peasantry is going to be a poor peasantry.
So by the time of Austen's novels, has that process kind of culminated, that process of the enclosure of those kinds of areas?
It's still going on.
Right.
It's still going on, but the high watermark of parliamentary enclosure has finished by that period, yeah.
So in terms of those other forms of sort of improving landscapes, landscape design, sort of creating these big and slightly more romantic looking vistas from your big house, we have the kind of legacies of those in the collections here at the museum in terms of the collections of the Landscape Institute. But a lot of that material is much, much later. It's sort of, established landscape designers from often the early 20th century. The reason this is really interesting in terms of Austen's work is that right here in Reading, and this is the campus of the University of Reading, we have the White Knights estate. And the White Knights estate was one of these designed landscapes of that period. So the 5th Duke of Marlborough, George Spencer Churchill, spent an awful lot of money creating a designed landscape. So the main campus of the University of Reading has a lake. It's an artificial lake. It has a wilderness, which is a sort of full of follies and sort of wild-looking plants, but all purposefully placed there. And he was so prolific with his investments in this kind of improvement that he bankrupted himself. He was also an antiquarian, and he spent a lot of money on books, a bit like a museum does. But these two interests really destroyed him. And it resonates really powerfully with some of the narratives that come through in Austen's work about that kind of improvement. Are there really good examples of this?
But there are some excellent examples of it. The slightly foolish character, Mr. Rushworth in Mansfield Park, is the great example of a young man who wants to improve his estate. He doesn't know very much about it. But Miss Bertram says, I think Mr. Repton, referring to Humphrey Repton, the great landscape designer, would be your friend on this occasion. And it's clear that Mr. Rushworth doesn't really understand what he's letting himself in for. And almost immediately, what's discussed is another cutting down of old timber. There's an avenue of limes which are predicted to be cut down almost immediately. And Fanny Price quietly quotes William Cooper talking about some trees being cut down to register her disquiet and disapproval of this kind of improving landscape work.
So that, again, I feel resonates slightly with contemporary narratives about trees, where, whenever anyone suggests the cutting down of a tree these days, it brings lots of people out in protest, and rightly so. So, the idea that you would cut down an entire avenue of trees, what would you be putting in their place, and what kind of view would you be creating?
Yes. Well, you would be creating, you would be wanting to spot the trees around in parkland fashion, wouldn't you? Instead, it's all about prospects rather than the sort of dynamism, I guess, is what you have with a really good avenue of trees. All of this sort of thinking about 18th century landscape design is very interesting. It's all on a very, very big scale indeed. And I think in the case of Austen, something that's quite interesting to think about. I mean, Ollie, you were talking about White Knights at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And the area immediately around Reading is very interesting in all of this sort of respect, because what Austen was used for by her 19th century readers, particularly by her nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, who's her first biographer, but also by Margaret Oliphant and various other 19th century writers who really popularized her, was she was supposed to be about small-scale village life. So, for instance, someone who's very interesting in respect to Jane Austen, another local Reading author, is Mary Russell Mitford, author of Our Village. Very good MERL connections indeed. She was based at 3 Mile Cross, which is just sort of south of Reading. And her mother knew Austen, so there's a connection. And Mitford is one of the first people to write essayistically about Austen. But the Austen critic Catherine Sutherland writes about this very well in her book, Austen's Textual Lives. The interesting thing about all these Victorian Austen people was that they wanted an Austen who was about small-scale village life, which was very prettified indeed, and which was very much about closing down those larger prospects, which are part of what is so fascinating about Jane Austen, that Austen understood the way that the Navy worked, and that she understood the way that national economics worked, and she understood about the relationships between rural communities and urban communities as well. So all of that sort of park designy stuff, which we can locate here so interestingly, I think is part of a sort of big distortion of Jane Austen, which really lasts for the first sort of 150 years after she dies.
So another nice connection to the White Knights estate from exactly this period are a series of designs and plans for the White Knights estate exacted by Thomas Christopher Hoffland, who also produced 2 paintings of the White Knights estate dated to about 1816. So just within Austen's lifetime, depictions of the old house at White Knights that no longer survives. And it's exactly the kind of landscape that Paddy was talking about, with trees dotted about and cattle and sheep artfully standing in nice aesthetic positions rather than meddlesomely getting wherever cattle and sheep tend to get. The paintings are in the University of Reading art collection, and the Hoffland book, which has these sort of different views of White Knights estate, is in the special collections of the University of Reading. And that brings us neatly back to Reading. And I think there's more to say about Reading.
I think there's a lot more to say about Jane Austen and Reading. Yeah, I mean, this really was the sort of centre of operations for her family in some ways. Her mother, Cassandra, was born in a village called Harpston, which is just south of Henley, so very close to here indeed. Her grandfather was the master of Balliol College in Oxford, and there were very strong Oxford collegiate connections. George Austen himself was a sort of junior don at St John's College in Oxford when he met Cassandra. So there are the Lees in Harpston. One of Cassandra Senior's brothers becomes the rector of Sunning-on-Thames, just outside Reading. James Edward Austen Lee, Austen's biographer, her favourite nephew, who we've talked about before, was for a while rector of Wargrave, just down the road, again, very nearby. He owned a house called Scarlett's, which is in Hare Hatch, just outside Wargrave, before he became vicar of Bray later on. I mean, really, you can be walking in the villages outside Reading and you throw a stone and you'll hit a monument that is an Austen or a Lee or a Knight or someone in the family. And, just to bring it right home to the Museum of English Rural Life, as I was walking down here from the White Knights campus, I walked past it's a development of, it looks like sheltered accommodation maybe, called South Hill. It's just opposite Upper Redlands Road. And Anna Lefroy, who is James Edward Austen Lee's elder sister, so Austen's oldest niece, who herself contributed some very important memories of her famous aunt in the 1860s to James Edward Austen Lee's biography. Her last letters to James Edward are written from a now demolished house on South Hill, right here where we are on Redlands Road. Wow. So you can bring Austen right home.
Wow, astonishing. That makes it even more interesting to have her letter in the exhibition today.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Austen on our doorstep. Austen on everyone's doorstep.
It's also really interesting to me that so many of her relatives were in the church. And something that occurred to me the other day is that two institutions that are really well represented in Austen's books but aren't really in our galleries are the church and the army. Is there a clear reason why that is when they were so prevalent in kind of rural communities?
Well, I guess in the case of the museum, that has a lot to do with where the museum emerges from. It emerges from a Department of Agriculture. It very quickly gets subsumed into conversations about early agricultural labour and working lives in the countryside. So predominantly the collections of the museum represent farming and other rural crafts and trades. Slightly later in the museum's history, it begins to collect things that you might think of as being more about cultural history, so art and other aspects of that sort of reception of the countryside. And also it begins to collect domestic material culture, so about people's lives within the home. But what it never quite gets to is really grappling with those other elements of what's happening certainly in Austen's rural worlds. And these were really significant components of what's happening in the English countryside. They're probably there. They're probably hidden in the collections. It's a little bit like the vestiges of landscape improvement. We have measuring chains and waywisers, and we might have a theodolite. We do have those things to do with Hoffland and the White Knights estate and other aspects of the university's collections. But we don't have a significant focus on landscape design. And definitely we have very little that relates very directly to the military or to the church. But they're amazingly important in Austen's writing.
In the episodes we did with Katrina Navickas, the influence of French politics on English agriculture cropped up a few times, talking about enclosure being driven by concerns over food shortages because of fear of invasion by Napoleon. That also seems like something that's very much in Austen's novels, the fear of invasion. I mean, soldiers always seem to be lingering in the background. I suppose Wickham is a prime example of a dastardly soldier who's...
Absolutely, yeah. The yeomanry have been summoned to Brighton on manoeuvres because the Napoleonic Wars are happening. I mean, you see it again, I think, in the most detail in her final novel, in Persuasion, which, of course, is a naval novel. And Admiral Croft very much hopes that he has the good fortune to go to war again. If we're lucky enough to have another war, he says, then we'll all go off and make some money. And Captain Wentworth and Captain Benwick and the other naval officers have been involved in recognizable naval operations that were part of the Napoleonic War off the Iberian Peninsula, in exactly the same way that, for example, Jane Austen's older brother Frank was involved in those things. Frank had the enormous misfortune of just missing Trafalgar. He was sent off by Nelson, who he worked with very closely indeed, on a sort of special mission out towards the West Indies. So he missed Trafalgar. And that was a great source of regret for him for the rest of his life.
But in the letter, there's another connection, isn't there, with the letter that we have. Jane talks about another brother giving topaz crosses to her and her sister. And
I think that is Frank.
I think it's...
Do you think it's Charles? There are two naval brothers.
We'll have to look that one
we
up.
can have a look, yeah.
But the reason they get these crosses is that he's made money from capturing a ship. So it's his prize money. And he's spending it on topaz crosses. And he says, he shouldn't be doing this for us.
Mm.
Yes, he will spend all his money.
Yeah. No, I just find it really interesting because I think it is easy to think of Austen as a writer about domestic, provincial scenes, but actually you do have the wider society and the political landscape in the images she creates.
And she had a cousin, I think it was a cousin, Eliza, who was married a French aristocrat. He wasn't very high up, but he was high enough up to be guillotined in the French Revolution. And she came over to Britain and would visit from time to time wherever the Austens were, and was considered a very glamorous, sparky sort of woman. And some people think that's the model for Mary Crawford.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, I think that's. I'm sure that's absolutely plausible. Of course, she marries brother Henry as well later on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thinking about the way in which the museum's collections have changed over time, and the fact that we've begun to acquire more things about representations of the countryside rather than the practical, technical aspects of farming and crafts and trades, this makes me think of the slight division in literature and ways of writing about the countryside and the Georgic tradition as opposed to the pastoral tradition. I don't know a great deal about that, Paddy, but could you give us a sense of what those two traditions are and how they both reflect and don't reflect Austen and the things that she's interested in?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Pastoral is very much the dominant one of those two genres because it is a genre that was adopted very enthusiastically by aristocratic court poets during the Renaissance. Pastoral poems tend to be idylls. They tend to be poems with very idealistic representations of rural life, particularly the pastoral life of shepherds. And those shepherds tend to be rather careless young people involved in sexual intrigues with milkmaids. It's that sort of thing. And the idea of the pastoral genre, I think, is it's a very courtly, ornamental genre, which is about retreat from the real world. But in a pastoral, you're always conscious of the presence of the city in the background. Something is being missed. Georgic is a much more problematic and chewy kind of a genre. It's a genre that became enormously important to 18th century literature during the 18th century. It's a very practical genre. It's a didactic genre. Virgil's Georgics is the sort of original of it, really. There are Greek forebears as well. But it is very much at the heart of the best-selling poem of the 18th century, which is The Seasons by James Thomson. That's a poem that Austen knows very, very well indeed. And it's very much the sort of cultural wing of the English Enlightenment, the economic Enlightenment that happens in Great Britain during the 18th century and of the agricultural revolution as well. It's about a description of rural life as hard and requiring resources and requiring, above all, this special thing called labor, which we think of as labor. But as far as Virgil is concerned, it's almost a sort of spiritual state, which is all about the state of humanity as well. So when we see Austen at her most Georgic, I think, there's a famous passage towards the end of Emma where a big party of people go on a strawberry picking party at Donwell Abbey at the invitation of Mr. Knightley. And there's a particular phrase that Austen uses where she's looking out at the view from Donwell Abbey, and she talks about, now let's see if I can get this right, English verdure, English culture, English comfort. It's often quoted by people talking about Austen and landscape.
I think it crops up in the trail.
There you go. And it's such an interesting phrase because it clearly there's quite a lot of there's a sense of the deliciousness of the setting for this strawberry picking party, which Austen communicates absolutely brilliantly. The word culture there is probably the strangest one to our ears. Culture at this point could simply mean agricultural production. It could mean like that. This is a view of a working landscape, not of a pastoral landscape, not of a stately home. It's beautiful because it's a working landscape. And I think that's absolutely at the core of Austen's Georgic tendencies.
So again, picking up on that idea of the Georgic tradition and that connection through to farming of this period, at Beamish, the Living Museum of the North, there's an amazing Georgian-era farmhouse called Pockerley. I think it's actually set slightly after Austen's time, so the 1820s, but the walls are covered in these wonderful paintings and portraits of big improved livestock. And you really get a sense of the kind of drawing room experience, as well as the sort of servants' quarter experience of the different worlds within these houses of that period.
We get sent lots of photos on social media of people taking pictures of the livestock paintings at Beamish.
They'll all be paintings that are in that particular period property as well. Yeah. And outside that property, they have pigsties. So it's got a kind of little hint of that model farm, improved farmyard. And the pigsties have on them labels about prize pigs or little posters about prize pigs, which actually have the name of the curator, Seb, who we know as the sort of mock farmer of the period who's improved these livestock. But anyway, I haven't improved any livestock here at the MERL, but maybe that's something we should think about.
We do have a toy farm.
We do have a toy farm.
You can improve that.
Trianon on Redlands Road.
It's hard to get those bloodlines sort of working in the toy farm environment there. You can't really crossbreed the cattle.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
Stick to chickens.
Yes. But if anyone could, Ollie.
Yeah.
But just
great ambitions.
Yes. Just on the topic of houses, I suppose a really nice place to end would be to think about Jane Austen's house, the museum in Wiltshire?
Chawton, Hampshire.
Chawton. The museum in Hampshire. Isabel, you have quite a long relationship with Jane Austen's house, is that right?
Yes, I was a trustee there for about 15 years. No, not anymore, but very good connections with them, and they've been extremely helpful with this trail and helping us to celebrate the 250th anniversary.
So what's the kind of quick history of that building and that home?
The building is actually medieval, and then it was added to. And just before Jane Austen and her family moved in, it was a bailiff's cottage. So it's got a mixture of spaces, but it's built in such a way that you would have a lot of outbuildings for activities. So it's not like the kitchen is sort of completely internalised. There's a bakehouse, for instance, that's an outbuilding. And originally it had quite a lot of land with it. And we know that Mrs. Austen used to grow potatoes, possibly in a smock, because it was a description of her wearing a dull brown dress over the top of her clothing. The interesting thing going round it is to see how small the spaces were. That her brother is in this enormous pile about half a mile up the road, and yet he put his mother and his sisters in a small cottage where the sisters shared a bedroom. But it was a beautiful setting, and it did inspire her to write novels.
So which novels did she write?
She tidied up and got to publication the early ones, so would be Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. And then she published Pride and Prejudice while she was there, and then subsequently Emma, Mansfield Park. Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, I think, were after she
Posthumous.
died.
Right.
1817. what you say about the relative smallness of the accommodation at Chawton Cottage. I got the exact same impression when I went a couple of weeks ago to 8 College Street, which is the house where she died in Winchester, right next to Winchester College. We were looking at the houses around it, and it really was a relatively modest residence, even compared to the other townhouses that were either side of it. Elegant and airy, but she didn't live a grand life despite her relatively close grand connections.
In terms of what Paddy was saying about relatively modest ways of living despite her connections, is this because she and her mother are of fairly modest means? I mean, there's family money, but it's elsewhere in the family. It directly kind of reflects some of the stuff that happens in the books with certain family members.
Yes, they have very little money that's really theirs. She does make some money from the books, but nothing like what you would expect. I mean, she wasn't really very famous when she died, and it was a few decades later that she became really popular. So yes, she had a little more money towards the end of her life, but things were very modest.
By the time she gets to Emma, she's better known. She strikes a very good deal with William Murray for the publication of that. But the great problem was that one of her favourite novels was Mansfield Park, and she insisted on Murray publishing a second edition of Mansfield Park, for which she took financial liability. So all of the money that she made with Emma, which did quite well, was wiped out by the non-sale of the second edition of Mansfield Park. So very, very small financial negotiations like that can be the difference between prosperity and her having plenty of cash, or the opposite.
And so I guess even though that end to the story of Jane Austen and her life is a sad one, she dies young, not aware, I guess, of the vast impact and success that her work will go on to have. She does die in the countryside, or rather in the rural environment that she preferred.
Yes, well, I suppose she's in Winchester, but it's the Hampshire landscape, and she's supposed to have died with her head in her sister's lap, looking out of the window, and I guess it was a peaceful death.
So picking up on a slightly more positive note, some years ago, Isabel, I remember that you went to the States and you went to a Jane Austen ball, and I just wondered whether you might tell us about what you wore and what that was about, and maybe that would help us think about some of the impact and legacy of Austen and her continued legacy.
Yes, well, one of the duties as a trustee at Jane Austen's house is that you have good relations with the various societies there are all over the world, and there really are. I mean, there's a Jane Austen Society of Brazil, Pakistan, Germany.
I called them Austenites earlier, or Austen heads, but it's Janeites.
Janeites.
Austen heads.
Austen heads didn't sound good, but Janeites sounds better.
But by far the biggest one is Jane Austen Society of North America. And they have an annual conference, and everybody is there, from wealthy people who just love Austen, a lot of academics, librarians. They have hundreds of people there. Some people will dress up in Regency outfits the minute they leave their front door, get on a plane to wherever the venue is in full Regency dress, and then wander around for the next 5 days. I wasn't quite as brave as that, but somebody said to me, "You must go to the ball and I will lend you my dress that I had made for it." So there I was in Regency gown, and you had a meal, and then there was a proper ball, and we had a caller, and we were shown how to do these various dances. And then there were people who sat at a libation table, which is drinks, I think. And there were people playing cards. It was wonderful, actually. And the thing that they do, which is really entertaining, is that they will go for a promenade. And it doesn't matter which city they're in. So one of the ones we went to was the first one I went to, I think, was Minneapolis. So wandering around the skyscrapers of Minneapolis in a Regency gown has to be fun.
Wow, that's a core memory. Yeah,
yeah, and the perfect contrast of rural and urban, and yeah, bringing a little bit of that sort of chic rural society to that very modern urban context.
Would you have described your gown as a mantua, Isabel? Is that the technical term? I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it.
Oh,
Mantua?
Very, very possibly. Yes. It was certainly a Regency style sort of high
Upholstered.
Yes, definitely. Yes.
So I guess just to round up this conversation, it's been absolutely brilliant having you both on. I mean, I think we've loved chatting about Austen, and we were looking forward to, the chance to just these worlds colliding. Do we get a sense from Austen, from her letters and from her protagonists of, what she really felt about the division between town and country? Where did she feel happiest, and what kind of fulfilled her the most?
I would say the country.
Right.
I think she had a strong sense of sort of belonging and place in the countryside, and was happy there.
No doubt about it. Yes, she's a country woman, but I think before anything else, she's someone who wanted a home. She was at her least happy, and she stopped writing during the periods when she was moving between the houses of various brothers, and those were sort of semi-urban places like Southampton. There's no doubt that when she got back to Chawton, suddenly she was able to write again. So she's a country woman, definitely.
I love that as a way of judging her life, that the literary output is what defines her.
So I guess home seems like a good place to finish, bringing it home.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Paddy and Isabel, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Absolute Units. I'm Joe Vaughan.
And I'm Ollie Douglas.
Absolute Units is made possible through Museums Partnership Reading, an Arts Council funded partnership of the MERL with Reading Museum. Thank you very much for being with us throughout this year. It's been amazing starting the podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah. So wishing you all a very happy festive season, however you celebrate.
Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. Happy holidays. And we'll be back sometime, probably mid-January, because we need to regather our forces in early January. That was a weird metaphor, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. And if you need an excuse to raise a glass on the 1st of January 2026, then you can think of the fact that it's the 75th birthday of the Museum of English Rural Life, which came into being on the 1st of January 1951.
We have a fine age.
Yeah.
It's
a vintage.
We're going to do a podcast about that at some point. We wanted to do a podcast about that before we ended for the holidays, but yeah.
I've got too much to say about the establishment of the Museum of English Rural Life, and we just couldn't squeeze it in. It's going to be a very long episode.
Four hours.
Joe doesn't realise quite how long this episode's going to be.
No, it'd be good though.
It'll just be a monologue, basically.
Yeah.
He'll have fallen asleep.
We also want to do an episode at some point about other things we want to talk about on the pod in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one about the past.
One about the present, and then another one that's just like a
future gazing.
Rambling, future gazing chat.
But probably not as rambling. Not like 4 hours of talking about the future.
No. But imagine what we get to within 4 hours.
Yeah.
Flying tractors.
A pithy vision of the future of rural England.
Wow. And on that, we'll leave you for 2025. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And happy holidays.